Named after former Secretary of the Navy James Vincent Forrestal, USS Forrestal CVA-59 would be constructed at the Newport News shipyard in Virginia. She was to be an enormous new class of aircraft carrier, bigger than any of her time. Her design included many features from the USS United States project, a proposed new carrier design that was eventually cancelled due to Air Force opposition. Her construction would take over 2 years to complete, and she would be launched on December 11, 1954. The ship's sponsor was Josephine Forrestal, the widow of James Forrestal, who was the ship's namesake. Powered by 4 Westinghouse-geared steam turbines with a complement of 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers going into 4 propeller shafts, making a total of 260,000 horsepower, where she could reach a speed of 33 knots. She was 1,036 feet long with a beam of 129 feet 4 inches, but due to her huge flight deck, her total width was 252 feet, with the ship displacing 56,000 tons, which would be increased to over 80,000 tons when fully loaded. Her officers and crew totaled over 4,000, and with the size of the ship itself and the flight deck, this allowed Forrestal to carry 85 aircraft, but it was possible to carry up to 90. She was the first ship in her class and was eventually followed by 3 sister ships, all of which would be commissioned by 1959. Compared to other carriers of the time, the Forrestal was an entirely new beast in terms of her size. By that time, all of the carriers in the Navy had served during World War II or were designed during World War II. This carrier was completely different, with a new angled flight deck combined with 4 steam-powered catapults for jet operations, a feature that the Essex and Midway class carriers had to wait for during service. She was also the first American carrier that was built with an optical landing system, which would prove to be essential for jet aircraft operations on U.S. carriers. The aircraft themselves reflected the rapid evolution of naval aviation, featuring advanced aircraft such as the A-3 Sky Warrior, F-8 Crusader, A-4 Skyhawk, F-3 Demon, F-4 Phantom II, and several other aircraft including the A-1 Sky Raider. USS Forrestal would begin her career undergoing training operations in her home in Norfolk, Virginia, as well as the Caribbean. She would then head to Mayport Naval Air Station in Florida for flight training, and after training was completed, she would depart for the Eastern Atlantic, ready to operate during the Suez Crisis, also known as the Second Arab-Israeli Conflict, if necessary from late October to early November 1956. By December 12th, Forrestal had returned to Norfolk, where she would be prepared to go out on her first deployment, joining the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean Sea on January 15, 1957. During her career, she would be deployed to major conflicts during the Cold War, as well as major ports around America, and take aboard dignitaries and the general public. However, this streak of flight operations and exercises did not go without tragedy. On September 26, 1957, an A-3D Sky Warrior piloted by Commander Paul Wilson approached the carrier too low and at too low of a speed during landing, most likely due to rain in the area, which created a highball, an optical illusion. The plane's main landing gear and its fuselage struck the ramp and continued down the flight deck in flames until crashing into the water, also damaging an A-5N Sky Raider that was parked on the deck. The A-3D Sky Warrior was not equipped with ejector seats, which sealed the fate for the pilot and his 2 other crew. A recovery was launched shortly after the plane hit the water, but only 2 helmets and a boot were ever recovered. The next year, Forrestal was called up again to support naval operations in the Mediterranean during the Lebanon crisis of 1958. Throughout the 1960s, Forrestal participated in NATO exercises in the Eastern Atlantic and in the Mediterranean Sea. In December 1961, she went back to Norfolk for a small refit, where she had 2 of her arrestor cables removed, leaving 4 cables remaining on her flight deck. She would be put back to sea in January 1962 and would be deployed back into the Mediterranean later in the year as the flagship for Commander Carrier Division 4. She would participate in NATO exercises in the area with fellow carrier USS Enterprise, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, while collaborating alongside French and British carriers. But it was from the 30th of October to the 22nd of November 1963 that Forrestal would achieve a major accomplishment, not just in her career, but in naval aviation history.
Perhaps the most dramatic use for the Hercules was recently demonstrated on the deck of the USS Forrestal during a series of tests exploring the feasibility of C-130 carrier operations. After a short period of C-130 training which simulated carrier operations, 2 naval pilots, Lieutenant James Flatley and Lieutenant Commander W. Stovall, accomplished the first Hercules on-deck carrier landings in a C-130F, a transport version of the KC-130F marine tanker with the external pods removed. Although both men were excellent carrier pilots, neither had ever flown a 4-engine aircraft before. However, with the easy handling Hercules, they proceeded to achieve a total of 29 touch-and-go and 21 unarrested full-stop landings and unassisted takeoffs.
Nevertheless, the tests were an astounding success. The C-130 would end up using 745 feet of runway on the deck during takeoffs and 460 feet for landings, setting the world record for the largest and heaviest airplane landing on an aircraft carrier, a record that still holds today. The tests were conducted 500 miles off the coast of Massachusetts. The conclusions from the test indicated that it was possible to land an AC-130 with 25,000 pounds of cargo and travel 2,500 miles doing so. However, it was considered too risky for routine COD operations. A few of the considerations were that a signal officer on the deck would give a signal to the flight crew to put the plane's engines into reverse thrust when the plane was 4 feet off the ground. The reason is that once the plane had hit the deck, the engines would already be spooling up the opposite way so that it could use that thrust to slow the plane down quicker. To add on to that, the plane was also fitted with anti-slip brakes, which weren't yet common on airplanes at the time. In the end, Lieutenant Flatley would be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the C-130 wouldn't be used for COD operations and would instead lead to the development of the C-2A Greyhound, which would enter service in 1966 and is still in service today. As the mid-60s came about, U.S. involvement in Vietnam was at an increasing level, with U.S. engagements involving the PAVN, the People's Army of Vietnam, against Viet Cong and Vietnam soldiers. U.S. carrier involvement was also increasing, starting with the Tonkin Gulf incident in 1964, Operation Pierce Arrow, and Operation Rolling Thunder. With increasing involvement in Vietnam, USS Forrestal would be called up to be deployed in the West Pacific at Yankee Station, joining fellow carriers USS Bonhomme Richard and USS Oriskany due to the high demand for airstrikes and bombings over Vietnam. She departed Norfolk, Virginia in June 1967, accompanied by USS Rupertus and USS Henry W. Tucker, first stopping at Cuby Point Naval Air Station in the Philippines before arriving at Yankee Station on July 25, 1967. Under the command of Captain John K. Belling, the carrier would launch her first airstrikes at 0600 that morning. Forrestal with Carrier Air Wing 17 would go on to launch over 150 sorties over Vietnam through the next 4 days, with her bomb and ammunition supplies rapidly depleting, launching attacks on targets, including a massive air raid on the Tan Hoa Bridge railroad bypass and ferry terminals. On the evening of July 28th at 7:20 p.m., The USS Diamond Head pulled alongside the starboard side of the Forrestal to deliver 16 1,000-pound bombs intended for use in the carrier's planned bombing sortie the following day. However, instead of the standard Mark 83 bombs typically used for contemporary airstrikes, the shipment consisted of older Mark 65 bombs, a type last widely employed during World War II and the Korean War, with these bombs bearing production dates as far back as 1953. To add to the danger, several bombs were leaking paraffin phlegmatizing agent from their seams, indicating that the bomb's explosive filler had degraded due to its age and its exposure to heat and moisture. For the bomb handlers, their concerns were very obvious, with many of them being too afraid to even handle them, with one officer wondering if the bombs could even survive a catapult launch without randomly detonating, while others said the bombs should just be tossed overboard to not jeopardize the ship. Captain Belling was deeply concerned and frustrated by the situation. He insisted that the USS Diamond Head take back the Mark 65 bombs and provide the newer Mark 83 bombs instead, but the Diamond Head radioed back saying that's all the bombs they had left. The reality was, by the mid-1960s, aircraft bombings in Vietnam had become so constant that the US military had drained its inventory of bombs, as the Mark 65 bombs had been returned to service due to the lack of Mark 83 bombs. Even some of the crew from the Diamond Head thought the ship had orders to drop the bombs overboard while on their way to Yankee Station. When they received the orders from Subic Bay, even the commanding officer of the Naval Ordnance Detachment at Subic Bay refused to sign the transfer, as he was shocked and thought there was a mistake in the paperwork. He refused to write off the transfer forms until he received written orders from the United States Indo-Pacific Command, or SINCPAC, clearly stating that he, as well as the people under him, wouldn't be responsible for the bombs being in poor condition. Captain Belling had no choice but to go forward with the bombs given to him. To the demand of the ordnance handlers, Captain Belling gave the order to store the bombs in the carrier's bomb farm between the carrier's starboard rail and the island until the next day's missions, rather than the standard procedure where the bombs would be stored in the ship's magazine. On July 29, 1967, at 3:16 a.m., a man overboard report was received on the starboard side. A helicopter would be launched by 3:20 a.m., and all engines were stopped at 3:24 a.m. At 4:16 a.m., a man was found by the helicopter, and a chair was lowered by the helicopter into the water to retrieve the man. But he fell out of the chair and into the water while being raised by the helicopter. Further attempts to find the man would prove to be unsuccessful, and the Forrestal would be secured from the man overboard alarm at 5:13 a.m. USS Rupertus would continue the search, but would also call off the search at 5:44 a.m. and rejoin the Forrestal, and the man, identified as Seaman Kenneth Dyke, was presumed lost. At 6 a.m. that morning, the first strike, consisting of 37 aircraft, would be launched, with all of the aircraft in the air by 7:49 a.m. and returning to the carrier by 9:14 a.m. The next strike would be the big one of the day, consisting of a strike at a railway line north of Hanoi. This strike would consist of A-4 Skyhawks and A-6 Intruders carrying the older Mark 65 bombs, with their escorts consisting of F-4 Phantoms armed with AIM-7 Sidewinder missiles and Zuni rockets. While preparing for flight operations, 7 F-4 Phantoms, 12 A-4 Skyhawks, and 2 A-5 Vigilantes were positioned at the stern of the ship. All were armed with weapons and fully fueled. A total of 27 aircraft were on deck at the time, getting prepared, each with a 3-digit identification number to get all the aircraft in the air as fast as possible Officers aboard approved the procedures that allowed ground crews to immediately connect the firing systems for the Zuni rocket systems while they were still parked, rather than being connected just before launch, which was the common procedure usually done, while also having their safety pins connected to prevent the rockets from firing, which would also only be removed just before launch. But ever since Forrestal began operations at Yankee Station over the past 4 days, unknown to senior officers aboard Forrestal, the safety pins themselves were also not reaching the aircraft while they were parked, either because of strong winds ripping them out or purposely being taken out by the crew to speed up the launch process and save time. At 10:34 a.m., the first of the A-3 Sky Warriors were launched, and an EA-1 Sky Raider at 10:49 was also launched, and then another at 10:50 a.m., as well as an E-2 Hawkeye early warning aircraft, which were on the catapult ready for launch. At the same time, Lieutenant Commander James Bangert and Lieutenant Lawrence E. McKay from VF-11 climbed into their F-4 Phantom numbered 110, which was armed with Lao-10 underwing rocket pods containing 4 unguided Mark 32 Zuni rockets, which were armed at the time. While performing their pre-flight checks, the engines were started using an external generator on the deck. Bangert then switched the aircraft's power transfer from the external generator to the aircraft's internal power. Doing that created a power surge throughout the aircraft's internal systems. One of these surges traveled its way through the wire that led to the firing system to the Zuni rockets. And at 10:51 a.m. and 21 seconds,
there, on deck, somehow a Zuni rocket has been triggered, roaring across the flight deck and hitting an A-4 Skyhawk. A sheet of flame from the A-4's ruptured fuel tank has enveloped the Skyhawk and her immediate neighbors. Behind that curtain of smoke, 2 1,000-pound bombs have already dropped from her wings onto the burning deck.
One of the rockets was launched from the pod and flew across the deck. The Zuni rocket screamed towards an A-4 Skyhawk parked on the other side of the flight deck, number 405, part of VF-46. Piloted by Lieutenant Commander Fred White, the rocket ruptured the Skyhawk's external fuel tank, igniting the fuel and starting a fire on the flight deck. The rocket continued past both White's aircraft and the Skyhawk next to him, which was number 416, piloted by Lieutenant Commander John McCain. Before impacting the water, shrapnel impacted both aircraft and were sprayed with fuel. The impact of the rocket would dislodge at least one 1,000-pound Mark 65 bomb from its rack and into the fire. Next to White and McCain's aircraft, several Skyhawks were engulfed in flames. One of the first to notice was McCain, the pilot of Skyhawk 416. He escaped from his aircraft and the flames by rushing onto the nose of his A-4 and then jumping off the airplane's refueling probe. Others would also escape their aircraft, such as Lieutenant Commander Herbert A. Hope, a part of VA-46. He would escape by jumping out the cockpit of his Skyhawk and ended up rolling off the deck and into the overboard net on the starboard side. Lieutenant Commander David Dollarhide, pilot of Skyhawk 417, would jump out of his aircraft and break his hip after he hit the deck. General quarters were issued across the ship. Sailors from Damage Control Team 8 rushed to fight the fire. They knew based on their training that they had 10 minutes to put out the fire before there was a risk of the bomb case melting, setting the bomb off. Leading Damage Control Team 8, Chief Aviation Boatswain's mate Gerald Ferrier immediately sprayed the bombs with a Purple K fire extinguisher to cool them down, without wearing any firefighting gear. Unfortunately, due to the bombs' poor condition, their composition of chemicals, and their age, their cook-off point was way shorter, and the force of the explosion would be much greater. Just over a minute into the fire, Chief Ferrier saw that one of the bombs was fractured open. He immediately tried to order his crew to get back, fearing the bomb would go off. And at 1 minute and 34 seconds into the fire, at 10:52 a.m. and 55 seconds, the bomb exploded.
The first explosion carries a message. The Forrestal is in deep trouble. It won't end here. The chain has started. And yet those who have survived it turn around and head back. There are buddies back there, and the chief with the purple K is dead.
Shrapnel was flung everywhere. The explosion had killed Chief Farrier as well as 26 other men, and of those a part of Damage Control Team 8, only 3 would survive, but with serious injuries. The explosion put a hole in the deck, spilling fuel into the hangar below and starting a fire. 9 seconds later, a second bomb exploded, causing a chain reaction, and 40,000 gallons of jet fuel from the aircraft on the flight deck ignited, contributing to the fire. To control the fire, Captain Belling ordered the Forrestal to slow speed. The 2 aircraft that were on the front 2 catapults waiting for launch were instead moved to the front of the bow to get more aircraft towards the front of the ship and away from the fire. The smoke being emitted by the fire could be seen for miles, and other ships in the area knew that the Forrestal was in trouble. Most of the pilots at the stern of the ship were able to escape, except for 2 who were killed in the explosions. Lieutenant John McCain, who barely survived the explosions after jumping onto the ship's catwalk while also trying to help a fellow pilot who was on fire, would assist ordnance men on the hangar deck to help toss the other bombs over the side to prevent those bombs from going off. Holes in the flight deck caused by the bombs exploding would let aviation fuel into one of the carrier's living quarters, resulting in a fire and causing many casualties. Some of the fuel making it into the hangar bays was due to the crewmen spraying the flight deck with seawater to try and put out the fire. However, others were using foam to try and put out the fire. While the foam would smother the fire, the water would just wash the foam off, giving the fire oxygen to breathe and reignite. While some crew members were fighting the fire, others were trying to move aircraft away from the fire and park them at the front of the ship. At this point, the fire had engulfed the entire stern of the carrier and was starting to creep up to the bridge while approaching the aircraft parked on the starboard side. With one aircraft in particular, an A3 Skyhawk numbered 614, which had 28,000 pounds of fuel on board. The crew realized that if the fire reached the aircraft, the explosion would be detrimental to the ship, and the fire would possibly not be fightable. Immediately, the ground crew went to work, moving aircraft out of the way to create a path for the Sky Warrior before eventually connecting it to a tug and then pulled it away from the fire, with the left wing of the aircraft striking a helicopter on deck before making its way to the ship's bow, while a blanket of foam was put over the fire to give their fellow sailors a bit of time to move the aircraft out of the way. 3 A-5 Vigilante aircraft numbers 602, 603, and 605 would receive damage from the fire. A failed attempt to push 605 overboard before being engulfed by the fire received major damage and would finally be pushed overboard by first a forklift and then a crane. 602 and 603 would receive damage from the fire before being towed out and also pushed overboard. On the other side of the carrier, 2 A4 Skyhawks number 310 and 316 would also be damaged by the fire, with number 310 being engulfed by the flames and 316 was tossed overboard. Destroyers USS George K. Mackenzie and USS Rupertus provided support to help fight the fires. The Mackenzie rescued crew members who had been thrown overboard, pulling them from the water, while both ships used their fire hoses to help extinguish the flames on the flight and hangar decks. Helicopters from fellow carriers USS Bonhomme Richard and USS Oriskany would take in the injured from Forrestal, as the carrier's sickbay had become overwhelmed. At 11:47 a.m., reports were made that the fire on the flight deck was under control. 30 minutes later, the flight deck fire was put out. During the afternoon, there were still bombs that were on the flight deck but hadn't exploded. Lieutenant Robert Cates, Forrestal's explosive ordnance demolition officer, spotted a 500-pound bomb and a 750-pound bomb on the flight deck that were smoking but hadn't detonated yet. He defused both bombs and, with the help of fellow crew members, would toss them overboard. He would also help lower sailors to defuse other bombs on the lower decks and have those tossed over the side, even with the fire around him. At 5:05 p.m., a count of the Forrestal's crew was ordered, even with fire still burning in the hangar bay, which would take hours to complete. At 8:33 p.m., the fire on the O2 and O3 decks were put out, but the heat caused by the fire still made it too hot to enter. It would still take hours for crew members to cool down the hot steel in the O2 and O3 levels, as well as control any fires that were still burning. At 8:54 p.m., Forrestal would rendezvous with the hospital ship USS Repose, and the transfer of the dead and wounded from all three carriers began at 10:53 p.m., as the dead and injured from Forrestal had filled up the capacity of all three of the carrier's sick bays. Just after midnight, at 12:20 a.m. on July 30th, the fires were under control. But the task of cleaning out hot spots, smoke, and cooling hot steel was still at hand. After many hours, all fires were finally extinguished at 4 a.m. on July 30th, 18 hours after they started. The damage to Forrestal was so severe that she had to leave Yankee Station and head to QB Point Naval Air Station to have enough repairs done so that the carrier could return to the United States for major repairs. An investigation was immediately launched by the Aircraft Carrier Safety Review Panel, being led by Admiral Forsyth Massey, which began on August 15, 1967, in the Philippines. After going through all the data, interviewing crew members, and testing ordnances, it came to the conclusion that the accident was just an accident, with no single person to blame. Contributing factors included lapses in procedures among flight deck and munitions personnel, a mechanical malfunction in Phantom 110 that set off the Zuni rocket, the presence of outdated and unstable bombs, and a general lack of firefighting training amongst most of the ship crew. Even so, Rear Admiral John Belling was relieved of command of USS Forrestal and would instead be put in command of the U.S. Iceland Defense Forces. The Forrestal fire taught many lessons, such as how one simple missile or bomb penetrating the defenses could knock out a supercarrier and her complement of aircraft. The Forrestal fire killed 134 and injured 161 sailors and aircrew, destroying 21 aircraft, of which 7 were F-4 Phantoms, 11 A-4 Skyhawks, and 3 A-5 Vigilantes. A further 40 aircraft were also damaged. The carrier itself suffered extensive damage, with repair costs estimated to be around $72 million, equivalent to $689 million in today's money. As a response to this incident, all Navy sailors and recruits received some firefighting training. New technologies would also help with fighting fires, such as a washdown system, which would spray the flight deck with either foam or water to fight fires, and would be fitted on all carriers, with many more fire safety improvements being implemented due to this accident. USS Forrestal would return to service in 1968, but would never be deployed back to the Pacific and would serve out the rest of her career in the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. She would be decommissioned in 1993 and would be listed as a possible ship to be donated and put up as a museum ship or as a memorial. However, due to lack of funds and lack of support, she would be sold for scrap in 2013 at a cost of 1 cent.